there was a place, a virtual place, that you could access from your phone or laptop, which was like the coolest lounge or cafe you've ever been in, like your own private club, a 360-degree immersive environment with a super rockin' band, playing cool jazz and smoking R&B, with the coolest, friendliest hosts and mixologists, and all kinds of intriguing and interesting guests, dropping by and sharing their lives, and exchanging amazing stories, where you could hook up with potential dates in a virtual social environment, or make new friends, or even business network. What if there were such a place? Now there is, thanks to our super cool, futuristic technology, Shindig 66.
What's Rockstar?
Rockstar is an energy drink.
Okay,
that's awesome.
When you say Rockstar, that has a completely different meaning to me. So you have to remember, I was born in the 20th century.
Well, Rockstar was kind of a thing back in the 2000s.
Okay.
And so definitely not anymore. But
So
she was talking about making October costumes, and I'm like, hey, it would be great. She has a beautiful body. It'd be great if you did some fetish outfits for Halloween. And she took offense and called me a creepy old guy.
Yeah, I actually got that on Tinder the other day too.
Yeah.
Some woman who liked me and then must have read my profile was like, "You're like a creep. How can you be texting girls half your age?" And then she blocked me, which I was actually grateful for that she blocked me, because this whole idea, like, first of all, she's assuming that I'm trying to like have sex with her or something. That's quite an assumption, Jim.
Yeah.
I'm actually interested in getting to know people of all ages. I'm not an ageist at all. I like older people. I like younger people. But I'm actually interested in having sex with very few people. I don't, that's just not an interest of mine. So she just made a giant assumption.
Yeah.
I wish I had in some way been able to text her back and say, look, you'd be lucky if I wanted to have sex with you and you wanted to have sex with me. That's not even what I'm doing. I mean, you don't even know. So like,
yeah. Yeah, for me, I think I was just like, oh, this would be really interesting. You have a different look, and like it'd just be new and fresh for someone like me. But yeah, the whole kind of like, this is inappropriate shaming when you're obviously selling yourself for a big corporate sponsor. I kind of like, and then telling me how I'm supposed to react to your sexy pictures is kind of like, that's what really kind of got me. So that's too bad. I mean, it's kind of like, on one hand, I'm happy, like, oh, wow, she actually bothered like the fingers to reply, because I would have just let it go probably. But yeah, it's interesting, and it's kind of like, do I live my life for someone like this person? Like, oh, this is inappropriate. Sorry, like, that is not really, like if people told me that when I was first kind of like at her age, and I listen to them, and then I lose,
Right. Well, the other way to look at that, though, is like I actually had an incident yesterday, which I don't want to go into detail about, but somebody approached me very, very angry about something that they thought I had done. And this was this is an IRL, in real life. This is not online. And for a second, I was kind of taken back and wanted to kind of get defensive. And then what I did was I took this kind of much more open attitude. I said, oh, that's really interesting that upset you. Can you tell me more about that? I'm really curious. And they were kind of a little bit taken aback that I wasn't responding aggressively. And so they kind of continued on that path for a few seconds. And then you saw their kind of heart open up, because they saw that I was like coming at this, rather than being defensive or aggressive back, I was actually like, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder what that's all about. And it actually completely changed the tenor of the conversation. So what I learned from that, when someone approaches me in what seems like an aggressive or defensive posture, I can actually do something different. I can kind of go, that's super interesting that you feel that way. Can you tell me more about that? I'm really curious. And it just completely changed the conversation, both for them and for me.
This whole thing started out as us hanging out when we used to be able to hang out in the same space. And Arian just gave me this amazing journey about how coffee really works on the wholesale and the cost of beans. And here I thought that my Pete's coffee was so fancy, and I had no idea. And then Chris, basically, and I have to agree with this, thinks that Western civilization was driven by coffee. So, yeah, Chris, why don't you give your introduction?
Well, I want to introduce our guest, Arian Hamidi, who started out as a client of mine, I think a little less than a year ago. And then we quickly became friends. And it's just been a fantastic process that we've gone through with him. He's still a client. We're still trying to get his project built. And I've become friends with him and just been drawn into his world a little bit. And basically he's a coffee nut, and he also does that for a living. And so maybe he wants to tell us a little bit about himself in general and about how that relates to coffee.
Well, thank you, Chris. And I'm really excited about everything that is going on. I'm so lucky that I've gotten a chance to meet the two of you. And it is absolutely my pleasure to try to give you guys a little bit of information about coffee. I'll give you a little bit background about myself. I have a background of being multicultural. Both my parents are immigrants, and I've always had a big fascination with food. My first girlfriend's family had a lot of contacts with doing specialty food in the Bay Area with contacts to Chez Panisse and whatnot. And my mother actually even worked as a baker at Acme Bread. My mom is German. She comes from northern Germany. And my dad is Iranian or Persian and was born in Hamadan in Iran. And the two of them met in San Francisco, and I was the result of that. But my mom also comes from a family baking background from northern Germany. And therefore, I've always had this kind of, tasting things, wanting to try things, and eating food. And I always thought that it would end up being something with, that I wanted to do something in the culinary, which I thought would be making food and whatnot, but ended up being that after going to design school at San Jose State, I did some design work. And then I fell back on what I did while I was in college, and that was being a barista and a coffee assistant manager at a Pete's. I ended up in Germany and needed to extend my visa, and I had the opportunity to learn how to roast coffee at a family-run gourmet food company, and they had a roasting portion. And the family started the business in 1928. And 2 years ago, when I was still there, we celebrated the 90th anniversary.
Caught my attention when you said your mother was a baker. And to me, the ultimate is having a baked good with coffee, whether in the afternoon for me, it's a cookie. And, in the morning, it's some sort of pastry. And I was curious, what is the ultimate pastry, either morning or afternoon, to have with a cup of coffee? And does it matter what kind of coffee it is to vis-a-vis what pastry you're having? Kind of like a wine, equivalent of wine and cheese, with certain wine, you'd have a certain cheese. So what are the right coffees to have with the right kind of pastry?
Well, I'll start it off in this manner, is that coffee has so many different flavors that a lot of people aren't really aware of what's available for the different types of coffees because of the different processing. I think that there's a gamut of different types of pastries that work well. I like to think of things in general with butter, things that are a little bit more buttery, just because butter is a flavor enhancer anyway. And so my ideal, it may sound funny, but like for me in Germany, was I would have my coffee in the morning with a buttered pretzel. Huh. So because they eat so many pretzels in Bavaria and as well in the north, what they'll do is at the bakeries, they have a cut pretzel, the big Bavarian pretzels, and then they put butter on it. And that with just a cup of coffee to me was really good. There's a little bit of salt on it as well. And I just enjoy that. I think that I'm trying to not take away too much from what the coffee is giving me in flavors. So that's a nice enhancer. And then I was trying to think of like stuff that I also enjoy that isn't maybe more in that German realm. And I would say that it goes back to the buttery croissant.
Can't go wrong with that. But
yeah, I just want to chime in something about that as well. I'm actually drinking a quad espresso now. That's my preferred beverage of choice. When I was about 18 years old and in college, my freshman year, a friend of mine saw me putting all this milk and sugar in my coffee, and he goes, "Have you ever tried it black?" And I was like, "No." And I tried it black, and I have not gone back. Black coffee is my preferred way of drinking coffee. In fact, it's so funny because whenever I see people putting stuff in their coffee, I'm like, "No, don't boil your coffee." So,
I think that's interesting, because the other thing that I would say too is that usually when I'm eating a pastry, or let's say not but a pretzel or whatnot, I enjoy to have the coffee black. If I'm not going to be eating something, then sometimes I'll tend to add some milk to it. Mm-hmm. I think that has just something to do with the way that I want to taste the coffee, because I know that I'm going to probably be ordering something that kind of plays with that flavor, and I want more of that flavor coming out with the play with the food. So that's the other thing too, is that it's kind of, there's some fantastic flavors that come out when you add milk to it, or soy or oat milk. And I think that that's actually an area of opportunity for a lot of coffee roasters that don't think about how their coffee may be being mixed with different types of flavorings that people are using because they don't want to have dairy, or they may have a problem with soy, and so therefore they're drinking the oat milk. And I think there's some very cool flavor opportunities there. And so I that's one of the areas that I am hoping to develop my palate even more, and to become someone that can really kind of take people through a little bit of a journey with the different flavors and seeing what tastes they get on their palate because of the coffees and the interaction with the food.
It also makes me think of another piece, which is like over the last couple of years, I went on a kind of a low carb keto diet, and a lot of folks promote this stuff. It sort of got the name of bulletproof coffee, although I don't think they started that way, where you actually combine the coffee with a lot of fat. Mm-hmm. Like even clarified butter. Mm-hmm. And, that's a way to have something to eat in the morning, basically the caffeine and the coffee and then fat, without actually breaking your low carb or ketogenic diet, so that your body stays in ketosis. And I was doing that for a while. I would just put a couple tablespoons of clarified butter in my espresso. And it's so weird how I got totally into the way that, not only the way it tasted, but the way it felt on my tongue. Mm-hmm. And so there's this whole experience of food, which is sensual, and then also becomes emotional. And I think this is one of the things about coffee that's really underplayed in our culture, is that coffee has a profound impact on our mental and emotional states.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that that's one of the things that, both of me and you, Chris, that we enjoy immensely is that we love to hang out, have a cup of coffee and spend a little time interacting. And it also heightens our awareness. We have fantastic ability to communicate. We're focused a little bit more. We have the energy. And when I think about coffee, a lot of times for me, truthfully, I don't drink as much of it as I used to, but my favorite, and I call it dosage, because I kind of feel like it really is a little bit of a dosage of how you're taking in your caffeine, but it's an espresso. The flavors that are in the espresso are also really important. When I was at the roastery in the morning, the first thing I would do is from coffee that we had roasted, I'd make an espresso. I would drink that, and just to see if it was on point to where it's supposed to be at, one that had a lot of the different coffees that we roast. But the other thing that I noticed was that it put me into a perfect equilibrium with enough caffeine, and then lasted about 2 hours, and then I'd have another espresso, just single shots. And I didn't feel like I had my crash that I tend to have sometimes when I drink a cup of coffee, where I go up and then I feel really a little bit too caffeinated, and then I come down. And so I always think it's like, okay, an espresso, I understand why the Italians love that espresso and the espresso on the bar, because it's just not too much. It's just that perfect amount. And I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish that's a perfect amount, one shot. I'm at 4 shots typically, and I have a couple of those in the morning. I just learned something interesting about caffeine a couple months ago. Caffeine does actually not, supposedly in terms of your physiology, it doesn't actually wake you up. What it does is it suppresses the hormone that makes you sleepy.
Oh.
So it's actually, we think that actually the caffeine is making us feel more awake, but it's actually the opposite. It's actually just turning off a hormone that makes us sleepy. So it's actually it's an interesting perspective on this.
Yeah. Well, Arian, I had a question. That Chris mentioned kind of like the sensuality of coffee, and then somebody mentioned like your first cup. My first Peet's Coffee, and you came in, I guess your gateway into the world was through Peet's Coffee, which back in, I think it was 1990 something. I can tell you what time of day it was, what store it was, and having the conversation with the barista, my first cup of Peet's Coffee, that it had such a profound kind of, emotional effect on me, and I was hooked. I was hooked to the point of, I would go out of my way 1.5 miles and be late for a meeting to find myself a Peet's Coffee so I could have a Peet's Coffee to enjoy before my meeting. So my question is, it's really hard to find that kind of first experience now. So how, for somebody newbie, or if somebody wants to reignite their passion for coffee, because I can't say the same thing for that store anymore. It's changed. How would you go about it? What would you suggest?
The way that I think about it for us at Goat Racer, we're kind of trying to be someone or a place that is encouraging people to understand what is so special about the specialty coffee area. And we're trying to also kind of be a gateway to understanding why some of the coffees taste certain ways. But we're trying to kind of keep it a little bit more traditional. I think when I think about coffees and I think about Peet's, or I always think about Peet's because that was growing up in Berkeley. That was kind of the coffee place. So you think of it as the start of specialty coffee. And so I think that it is pretty difficult. I go around and I try stuff, and even my palate changes and develops as I try different things. So I think it's a really hard one. I think that the key thing is you can tell really quickly, I feel, if you're going into a place that is open and engaging to their customers, where they know that there's a lot of people who are maybe trying stuff new or trying something different, and being able to explain to them, and being warm and friendly, and also not being arrogant about it. And I think that then it creates this totally different kind of relationship with what's going on with the coffee, because as soon as the person is giving you that attention, compassion about everything that's going on there, and helping the customer become a little bit more educated, the barista is also able to offer something that's a little bit better. The issue that I have a lot of times with that is that in the Bay Area, you have a lot of people who, or a lot of people, it tends to be, maybe it's not as bad as it used to be, but you have the baristas who think that they know everything in the whole world, and they just think of their customers as these unknowing, unwanting to know, not hoping to understand why this coffee tastes this way, and they don't like it.
Well, yeah, I think this question of how we interact with coffee emotionally and physically is really critical. And, you know, Arian and I have already had some experiences with, there was this one cafe that we used to hang out pretty regularly, and even more regularly, Bika on College Avenue. Mm-hmm. And it was just in my walking path back and forth to work and to BART. So I started just stopping there and having coffee, and I became really close friends with a couple of the baristas. And then I met Arian, and he's like, "Oh yeah, that's the best coffee place in the Bay Area," or something like that. And it was like, then Arian and I started going there. And what was really a critical piece of all of that was my interaction with Peter and Christopher, who were two of the baristas there, and their interaction with other customers. They had a little seating area at the bar, which I think is absolutely critical to creating that kind of atmosphere. You didn't sit at a table. They actually had limited tables, but you could stand at the bar or sit at the bar and talk with the baristas, and they encouraged that. And it actually, to me, it felt like Italy, because that's the kind of experience you have in Italian cafes. You can stand at the bar and chat with the barista. In most American cafes, it's kind of discouraged. The barista is a little bit separated from the people who are taking the cash and not really interacting with the customers because they're so busy. Do you want to comment on that, Arian?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it goes, there's another part of that, is the patience that they have in Europe. You know, when you think about it, there's two things. One is that everybody's a little bit more patient about getting their coffee. They'll sit down, and they know if they're sitting down. If they're at the bar, it's a little bit different, but there's also another aspect, is in Italy, you pay a different price to sit at a table than you do if you go to the bar, with the idea that sitting at a table costs us a little bit more money. We probably are going to have a server. So if you order at the bar and you pay for it, then you're expected to drink that espresso at the bar, and then you go. Of course, it's a little bit of a faster experience, but it's not, I think, the same type of experience that you get, or what people want to get in the US. The US is kind of like, well, I just need this coffee now, and that's kind of the idea. And so the barista doesn't necessarily realize that that's such an important part of the experience.
We went to this place called Home in the Richmond district, which roasts their own coffee. And it's one of those places, I'm not sure if I talked about this last time or not, but we did talk about it, how I used to go out of my way to a Pete's Coffee to, to get a coffee and be late to a meeting. This is the same thing. We were in Golden Gate Park. We went, all the way, kind of a mile, half a mile, maybe a mile out of our way from going home, just to go to this area in the Richmond district, just to go get this particular coffee. And I had the coffee, and afterwards I was thinking, yeah, it's pretty good. Like it had that feeling that I like coffee to have. Like, yeah, I think I might go back there, just like a heroin addict, thinking, yeah, maybe I'll go back and see what my dealer's up to. I guess, I don't know. I'm not a heroin addict, but I think you get the analogy.
Yeah, well, I had a question about that as well. Do you order the same thing from them, or are you confident enough that everything that you get from them is of a quality that you enjoy?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So it all starts, I think, with the coffee. And so far, I think I've done 2 cappuccinos and 1 drip.
Okay.
And it's kind of like what I'm in the mood for, what coffee thing I'm in the mood for. And I haven't actually bought the beans and brought them home yet, but that's probably my next step. So as long as the coffee itself, I feel, has a, the quality of the beans and their roasting has that kind of threshold, then I'm pretty good with whatever they make, assuming, of course, that they have a competent barista. Um, and that's a huge deal, because I can tell you, there's another place who just started doing Equator Coffee, a little store, and they're actually kind of trying to figure out how to make it work. I think in our neighborhood, they originally opened as a very high end kind of wine and cheese place, and
Mhm.
of course now lockdowns happened. It's just like, whoops, very bad timing. So now they're getting Crafts and Wolves pastries, and I think they're doing Equator Coffee,
Mhm.
but they have a bad barista, and so they don't really know how to make a cappuccino. And my wife, having spent 10 years in Italy, is very particular about how her cappuccinos are made. So that's kind of yeah, I have to have that trifecta. For me, I think it's more important you have the good coffee to begin with, the good base, of good tasting, well roasted. It's going to taste. But I think with anyone else around me, I have to have the confidence that they know how to prepare it as well.
I think it's absolutely true. I mean, you can have fantastic coffee, but if you're not taking care of the milk, and then the other thing about it also is just not maybe understanding what can happen to the coffee that comes um, out of the portafilter that goes in there. Because depending on what the speed is, and depending on the grind, and then also depending of the volume of coffee that you have in that basket, and there's a lot of things that go into play there. And I would say that, like, I would consider myself like intermediate as a barista, understanding. Practically, probably not beginning, but definitely the practice of going through it takes some time and understanding, and that I'm probably not quite as far along. But there's a lot of stuff that goes into play there. That's a huge, huge thing. And depending on what type of espresso they're going for, if they're going for a traditional Italian type of espresso, or if they're deciding to go with an espresso that is more designed for milk drinks.
Interesting.
Um, on the flip side of that, though, is also an espresso needs to be strong enough. So sometimes when these coffees are roasted for an espresso but are lighter roast, they also have to increase the amount of grounds that are being put into the basket, where for the espresso machine. Because if you're doing a lighter roast, then you're going to have to increase the amount of coffee that's in the basket for the espresso drink. Because if not, then you're going to end up with flavors that don't come through the milk as well.
Hmm.
Whereas stronger, darker roasted espresso, you can probably do the normal. It's about 8 grams of coffee, and something that's more fruity, you're probably going around 19. You could go as high as even 20, but then you also have to change the basket depth.
Now, it reminds me that whenever I would go to Bika and deal with the 2 baristas that I really dealt with there, Peter and Christopher, they would be telling me that all through the day they would be grinding and tasting the espressos and weighing them out and deciding the right temperature, the right grind. And it was an ongoing process of them really paying attention. And then, if I was sitting there long enough, sometimes I would be sitting in there for a couple hours. They would make an espresso for me and say, "How does that one taste? Does that taste better? What do you think of that one?" Because they also wanted other perspectives other than their own. because you can imagine if you're drinking coffee all day long, your taste buds become a little bit, infected or, biased towards certain things. So that's one of the reasons I really love that place. I mean, other than the fact that it had a coffee bar that was social, was that those baristas really, really were paying attention to that stuff. And I think one of the reasons they found me interesting was that I was one of the few people who would actually just drink an espresso, because it is pretty unusual to have Americans drinking straight espresso. So most folks are not tasting all that stuff. They're tasting, the milk and the sugar and whatever other flavorings they throw in there.
You mentioned before that you started off in Pete's, and actually I have kind of a dirty secret that I actually was a Starbucks barista for a short period of time. But at that time, I know, I can't believe it. I was actually quite impressed with them as an organization. Say what you will about them now. Back then, they put me in coffee training for almost a week before they let me even behind the counter, of really learning how to slurp it, watching videos, talking about different smells. Most of it kind of went in one ear and out the other, but I certainly learned how to do a good French press because of that. But I think they really, they took it was no accident that they grew to be the huge organization that they are, because back then they definitely took the time to properly train their baristas, both on how to make the right coffee and recommend, as well as kind of your whole interaction with the customer. They were very particular about how to do that.
That's interesting, because when I was at Pete's, one of the things that I know about Pete's was that, in going through it, their educational stuff that they did for their new hires was also very detailed. We even got to go to do like a little coffee discussion and tasting. And then also I think we did it with teas with them as well. And they gave us a little book and we could take notes and whatnot to, decide what we were tasting and what flavors we were getting out of the coffees. But the one thing that I don't remember being something, and this could be also that I just missed it, or that I didn't engage in it, or I don't know, but I don't remember that being that much of the customer service part of it. And I remember for the first, I would say probably a year, when I was working at the cafe, my way of dealing with things with the customers was that I was working as hard as I possibly could, and I was cordial and I was friendly and I'd engage them. I guess I wouldn't engage them at the level that I should have, but I would, be courteous to them. But I wasn't explaining to them what was happening. So therefore, I think a lot of people were just kind of annoyed with me sometimes, because I would be sitting there running around doing stuff, but I hadn't taken the time to just say, hey, by the way, I'm on it. I've got this stuff going on. Your drink is being made right now. I have this other stuff that's going on as well, or just kind of engaging the customers in a different type of way. And I think that's really important, to be able to, if you're working as hard as you can, but you forget to communicate, people they think you're ignoring them.
Yeah, it makes such a big difference. And a lot of places now, I kind of sound like the grumpy old timer when I say this, but these kids, I went into this one place in my neighborhood to get a drip in the afternoon, and the barista's like, we don't do drips in the afternoon. And I was just like, oh my God, they just, which in fact, he was just lazy. He didn't want to brew some coffee that afternoon. And they lost me for a couple of months. Fortunately, the place is actually, it's good enough coffee. And that guy's gone, that I'm actually coming back. But that whole complete connection that you have, and then the relationships you make around it, are are huge. And so this is a dating site too. We talk a lot about dating. I've dated a few baristas as well, which is great. There's, but it's kind of like almost like the connection you have. It's like your favorite bartender, you know. You want someone who knows, and they taught you that as well. They was like, okay, Kim is coming in. She likes cappuccinos, and she likes them old school Italian way, not like lots of milk. You gotta get the froth just right with that. So that connection. So when people are in the door, you kind of acknowledge them. You know what they like already. That just kind of completes the circuit, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the people who came in regularly at Pete's, I remember one of the things was, you knew what they were going to have. And so a lot of times if you saw them come in the front door, you already started on their drink, even though there may have been a line of people waiting for their drinks, or there may have been a line of people waiting to order their drinks. You already were like, okay, I know this is coming. And once it was ordered, you kind of set it up there already.
You're right now, you're working with a company that's importing coffee from Germany.
What we're doing is we have our Goat Racer line of coffees, which isn't that abundant yet, but we have 3 filters, and we're in the process of developing 2 espressos.
So will it be roasted locally?
Yes, it'll be roasted locally at a co-op in Berkeley called Coro.
Oh, okay. So where is the coffee coming from? Is it specifically coming from certain areas of the world, or are you sort of just finding the best coffee? And
what we're doing right now is we've got 3 different importers that we're dealing with, and I thought that it would be interesting to deal with 3 right now because I have a little bit more of time to actually spend to try the different coffees. And so what happens is that, they all have sales reps who, you call them and tell them that you're interested in these types of coffees. Maybe you say like Brazilian, and, specifically maybe you tell them some of the flavors that you want, and then they recommend some stuff and they'll send you samples. These are green samples usually. And then once you get them, you go at Coro, for example, they have a roast facility where you can do sample roasting. And so they have a small double barrel ProBot that is a sample roaster. And the sample roaster roasts 100 grams at a time. So you roast 100 grams on these small little dual drums. And you go through that and you do all those roasts, and then after you're done with that, you let it sit for 24 hours, and then you cup them and taste and decide which ones you like and which ones you don't like.
Can you just kind of summarize like why I would buy Goat Racer coffee, say, over all the other 400 brands of coffee that I can find in the Bay Area? Like what makes what you're doing special, unique, interesting?
Well, what we're doing here right now is we're kind of like we're really focusing on the quality of our coffee. We're also really focusing on the education of our customers. And we're trying to make sure that we don't take for granted what our customers need. We want to make sure that we're offering them detailed information, kind of also explaining to them what other possibilities there are with specialty coffee. And I think that engagement that we're trying to offer is something that's a little bit, I think that everybody wants to do or is trying to do something similar to that. It's a matter of how able they are to meet that goal and educate and be able to facilitate those things. I personally, I keep on always going back to this. I think that this is also kind of something that I want to really make sure that is built into the culture of this coffee roasting company, which is this idea that when you buy a coffee from us, you are purchasing, you know, pretty much the coffee is like a golden ticket to be able to come and talk to the roaster. It is the invitation to spend some time with the roaster. Of course, right now for our situation, it's not quite as easy to do that because we're roasting at a co-op and we can't just have the public come into that space. But eventually that's one of the big goals that we want to have. And me being somebody that is at all the different phases right now, and because we're so small, I can engage people. I want to make sure really that they understand that because they're buying the specialty coffee, that means that they are also, it's not just the experience of how the coffee tastes, but it's also the discussion with people that are really excited about coffee and that engagement of, you know, what the different processings are that you can have for coffees and how that can affect the coffee. And then also trying to stay on top and understanding some of the newer stuff that's going on, from coffee that is naturally lower in caffeine, which they're starting to have now. Well, I mean, I think it's kind of a cool thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. I mean, like, you know, at the end of the day, if I was out and about and I didn't want to have a decaf, or I think what it does is it starts to open up the opportunities of having a coffee that hasn't been processed and it has lower amount of caffeine in it.
I think it's really,
yeah, I'm teasing you.
yeah.
I'm teasing you. Of course, I drink decaffeinated coffee as well.
Well, I mean, the other thing too about it is that it's really intriguing to see how that's going to come about, because the price point for it right now is so expensive. I was talking to one of the importers and I was surprised because I didn't think it was going to be that expensive, but they were saying that it was $25 a pound for the one that they had.
And hang on, Arian, I wanted to interrupt you because this is very interesting to me. So the $25 a pound, that's to you, the roaster. What does that equate for the consumer then?
Well, it depends. It depends how the coffee roasting company is looking at it, because you have a lot of different opportunities there. You can do a special offering and you'll say, okay, I'm doing a special offering. I know that how expensive this is. Am I gonna push the exact cost onto my customers? Or am I gonna say, well, I'm gonna subsidize it with some of the other stuff that I'm offering as well so that they have the opportunity to try it.
But generally the rule of thumb is 3 times. And feel free, if you want to deflect and not answer the question, that's fine. But I found it was fascinating because I didn't realize.
I think that you have to realize is that you pay a certain amount of money for the beans.
Right.
You end up paying a certain amount of money for, you know, the process of roasting it. So the energy that you use, the machinery that you have to buy or rent to roast on, and then also the labor that you're using to do that. And so when you start adding all those little bits of costs in there, you can kind of also understand why, you know, a place that is got more production, you know, is making higher sales is probably a little bit more competitive on their pricing than maybe a smaller place that's starting up. But I also beg to differ, or at least I think that you have to make sure that you have, when you start out, that you have fantastic quality control set up so that you have a system where you say, okay, we are cupping our coffees on the roaster, so we know what's going out there. We're not just cupping, you know, 50%. We're not just cupping 10%. We're actually cupping everything that we're doing to make sure that we're staying on course and we're offering what we want to our customers. Because in the end, it is it's a product that's always changing. The moisture content of the coffee is always becoming less. As the moisture content is changing, there's things that are happening inside of the coffee bean that you don't know about. And as much as you want to be consistent on your roasts, Your roasts are going to also kind of fluctuate in how you want them to roast. It can be the temperature of the air outside. It could be just, for example, it's wintertime, your coffee beans are just colder when you put them into the machine. And that affects the whole way that it's going to end up roasting it.
Okay. So I'm really interested in this idea of what the economics of all of this. And I'm sure Arian can comment on this, and we all have heard something about this, that like if you're paying, you know what, $25, $75 a pound for something, like I can't remember the last calculus we were looking at for this incredible coffee. But the people who are actually picking the beans are making pennies. And coffee is really interesting in that way. And I'm sure it's not the only crop that this is true of, that, you know, each person who touches it along the way is usually higher up in social status. So you get to the folks who finally are drinking it, who are the, you know, the 1%ers like us. And yet the folks who are actually doing really hard labor, from my understanding, what I've read about it, to actually pick the beans are living in absolute poverty, most of them. So do you want to talk about that, Arian?
From my understanding is that they have these people who do picking, and they go through, usually they're a group of people, and they are taken from one, you know, I think that they collectively come together to one place, but then what they do is they take them around to the different farms and they do picking, and then they go to the next farm and they do picking. And so they're kind of moving through the country and they'll do their picking. And then depending on what types of coffee it is, you know, because if you're talking about specialty coffee, you're talking about it's hand-picked coffees. Then if you're talking about more industrial coffee, where it's cheaper, then you have machines that come through and shake the trees, pick up the stuff that's on the ground already. And a lot of times for the, you know, higher end specialty coffees, they go through and they'll do, you know, three picks of the trees. You know, they go through. I don't have a picture on me, but when I was roasting in Germany, we had some pictures, and you can see that on the coffee tree, that the coffee fruit doesn't ripen all at the same time. It, you know, it goes. There be sections that are red and they're ready. And then there's other parts on that same branch that are still green. And so they have to go through and pick those separately at different times. And that's a huge part of, you know, the quality of it. I know that there's also some different varieties that usually they go from green to yellow to red, but there's also varieties that go only green to yellow. So, I mean, I'm sure that that's not that hard to tell. Then you see how, you know, dark yellow they are. But yeah, they go through and they do the picking. And one of the things, what a lot of people are trying to make sure is that there's also a some type of structure, some type of system that is giving them a decent, like a paying wage. And that's what we talk about, the fair trade. I tend to think that usually they probably make some more money if it's direct trade, which would be direct from the plantation, being if you're not, you know, going through the importer directly. Like, so if you have that contact, I'm hoping, I can't tell you because I haven't been to that point of the supply chain, and I haven't, you know, been able to look at the books. And I guarantee you, even if I do get to that point, then that's a conversation I have to have with the plantation owner and have me or feel like I can trust what he's telling me, because I'm sure he's not going to open up his books and show them to me and say, hey, they make this amount of money. But
that's actually one of the big kind of selling points, I guess you would say, of things like the blockchain, which Bitcoin is built on top of. The idea of smart contracts, so that a local grower can actually engage in a smart contract with someone, and it's technologically, you know, with the blockchain, it's basically a triple ledger. Like the way to understand is basically there's two ledger, buyer seller, then kind of like the blockchain itself, I guess. I might be butchering this, but basically, so there's no kind of cooking the books if you're actually doing a smart contract on the blockchain. It's like, okay, it came from this guy, and then they settle on the price, so it kind of cuts out a lot of the middlemen there.
So it's more transparent.
It's more transparent, and it's in theory, it's a better opportunity for the farmer, because then they can just engage someone like yourself or your company could engage directly with them through the blockchain as opposed to a third-party broker.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing that I know that people are trying to also set up is that there's, there are groups that are trying to make sure that the pickers have some type of, that they're getting a certain type of quality of life, but also that there's certain health opportunities, as in like some type of care, that there's something also for their children, so that there's educational types of things. That's what I hear. And I don't know very much about that. And there are groups who have, there's certain types of coffees where you buy and I'll say, this coffee supports this group, or this type of money is being allocated to help the pickers. But it also depends how poor the country or how well their ecosystem is set up, because there's some countries that are just in really pretty bad shape. I mean, from what my understanding is, there's a few countries in Central America that the workers that are doing a lot of the picking are really not getting paid much at all. And so there's issues with, it happens because of the supply chain as well. There's issues with that. There's unrest. So that creates also problems with it. So I don't know specifically, and I can't answer specific questions. I wish I knew more about it.
I'm fascinated with the whole commodities behind coffee, and I'm curious what your view is in the next year or so, like how prices are going to go in general, and demand, and just kind of everything around that. And I guess at a certain point, it's what is the end person, people like me and Chris and my wife are willing to pay to kind of back out all the way.
Yeah, I just want to as long as we were talking about all this economic stuff, I just also want to just recommend two books which I read about this. One is called Uncommon Grounds, by Mark Pendergrast, which the history of coffee and how it transformed our world, which is a really great. I mean, it goes into detail about the discovery of coffee in the Middle East and in Africa, the dissemination of it through the New World. It talks about Pete's, it talks about chock full of nuts, Starbucks. It connects all of these things. It's really fantastic. And then another book, which is I think a little earlier, is called The Devil's Cup by what's his name? Stuart Lee Allen. Coffee, the Driving Force in History. And it's similar to Uncommon Grounds, but it's a little shorter, and it's more about the author's personal journey. He travels around the world kind of trying to understand the economics of coffee, the history of coffee, how it intersects with all of these cultures. I have to tell you, what's interesting about both of these books, it's not a pretty story. When you look at how coffee has affected the economies and lives of the folks, especially the folks who pick it, and the countries where it grows. The other thing I just wanted to touch on quickly, because this is something that Arian did a little education with me about, and also these books helped me, is we're really looking at two main varieties of coffee, what we call Arabica and Robusta. And I just wondered if Arian could just kind of talk about those briefly.
Okay. So both are really important. The Robusta is one of the parents of the Arabica. And the the big difference in general is that the Arabica has always been top dog, for lack of a better explanation. It had a lot more interesting flavor directions. It was the coffee that, you know, was looked at as having interesting profiles in the cup, whereas the Robusta tended to be pretty consistent with not as much interesting flavors. We'll go back to the Robusta. The Robusta grows at much lower altitudes. It's a much hardier tree. It's not as susceptible to the different climates. It's not as heat sensitive, it's not as water sensitive, and it's not as insect sensitive. So also that means it's also not as susceptible to disease as well. So therefore it's a very intriguing tree because it's just a stronger plant. And there are different levels of Robusta. So then what you have is you have the Arabicas, and the Arabicas grow at a much higher altitude. And they're much more sensitive to the weather. You know, they want cooler weather at night. Well, it also has to do with the types of flavors you get out of it. So the cooler weather at night, the warmer weather during the day. And from everything that I've been able to tell, it kind of reminds me of what we used to think of what the weather was like here in the Bay Area, just at higher altitudes. You know, in certain areas where maybe the altitude isn't quite as high, what they'll do is they have like canopy trees that are kind of planted in the area so that the sunlight is they get some direct sunlight, but then there's some cooling. And so there's a lot of interesting things that the plantations do for different regions.
This is the coffee that I'm drinking right now. Cafe.
That's fine, Chris. That's the same stuff we drink.
Okay. This is, have you had this, Arian?
I have not, no.
Okay, you got to come over and have this. This is actually incredible.
Okay.
This is 10 ounces. It's at Safeway. This is $3. Yeah.
$3.99 usually, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, they have it on sale. I usually buy it on sale.
Okay.
It's obviously completely vacuum packed, and it's a good vacuum seal.
What coffee beans are in there?
That's one of the things I want to get to. It does not say Arabica anywhere on this package, so you have to assume it's mostly Robusta, right?
Yeah, probably.
That would be the assumption, because that's obviously the cheaper bean. When you pointed out to me several months ago that my predilection for the Italian-style coffee, which I had in Italian cafes, probably was because it was Robusta, I actually actively sought out coffee beans that did not say Arabica, and I think you were right. That's the coffee I like. And again, maybe it's because I'm drinking straight espressos that, you know, that's that kind of taste. It's definitely not sour. It's not burned, but it's clearly very charred, I would say. It's a very dark, rich, but it's also a very simple taste. It's not a complex taste. It's a very simple taste.
We're coming out. I think we have a minute left here. So, Arian, thank you so much for being part of our first podcast. And man, so much great information here. We'll probably do a part 3 at some point in the not too distant future. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
With a super rockin' band playing cool jazz and smoking R&B with the coolest, friendliest hosts and mixologists and all kinds of intriguing and interesting guests dropping by and sharing their vibes and exchanging amazing stories, where you could hook up with potential dates in a virtual social environment or make new friends or even business network. What if there were such a place? Now there is, thanks to our super cool futuristic technology Shindig 66.